After saving a woman from the street, the millionaire discovered that she was the heiress to a fortune greater than his own. The squeal of tires against asphalt echoed through the deserted Manhattan street, followed by the deafening thud of a body falling to the ground. Alexander Rothschild, CEO of Rothschild Enterprises, felt his heart race as he abruptly slammed on the brakes of his limousine. In an instant, he found himself running out of the vehicle, ignoring his driver's protests. "My God, are you all right?" Alexander shouted, kneeling down next to the figure lying on the sidewalk. It was a woman, her long brown hair partially covering her face. She moaned softly, trying to sit up. I think so," she mumbled, blinking confusedly. "What happened?" Alexander breathed a sigh of relief. "You suddenly pulled out in front of the car. Thank God we managed to stop in time." He reached out to help her up, noticing her threadbare clothes and the frightened look in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "I wasn't paying attention. I was just trying to—" "It's okay," Alexander reassured her, frowning as he noticed a bruise on her face that didn't seem to have been caused by the near collision. "Do you need medical help? I can call an ambulance." The woman shook her head vigorously. No, I'm fine, really. I just need to go." When she tried to pull away, Alexander gently held her arm. "Wait, please. You seem to be having a hard time. Let me help you. What's your name?" Hesitating, she replied, "Caroline. Caroline Astor." The name made Alexander raise his eyebrows. Astor was a surname associated with one of the richest and most influential families in New York. But what would an Astor be doing in this state, wandering the streets alone at night? "Caroline, I'm Alexander Rothschild. Please let me take you somewhere safe. We can talk and see how I can help." Caroline looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "Why would you care? You don't know me." Alexander smiled gently. "Sometimes the universe puts us on the right path to make a difference in someone's life. I believe this is one of those times." After a moment's hesitation, Caroline nodded. Alexander guided her to the limousine, signaling to the driver, who was watching the scene with curiosity. As the car glided through the illuminated streets of New York, Alexander couldn't help thinking about the strange encounter. Caroline Astor, if that really was her name, was an enigma. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was an undeniable elegance in her gestures, a refined diction in her speech. What could have led someone of his supposed social standing into such a precarious situation? "Where are we going?" Caroline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To my house," Alexander replied. "I have a private doctor who can examine you discreetly. Afterwards, we can talk about your situation and how I can help." Caroline nodded, leaning back in the leather seat. Her gaze wandered over the city passing by the window, a mixture of emotions crossing her face. Alexander watched her curiously. In his years as one of the richest and most powerful men in New York, he had learned to trust his instincts. And his instincts told him that there was much more to Caroline's story than met the eye. As the limousine approached his mansion on the Upper East Side, Alexander couldn't help feeling that his life was about to change drastically. What had started out as an ordinary night at work had turned into something much more intriguing and potentially dangerous. As the gate to the estate opened, Alexander made a silent promise to himself. He would find out the truth about Caroline Astor, no matter what the cost. Little did he know that this decision would take him on a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about wealth, power, and the true meaning of fortune. The Rothschild mansion rose imposingly before them, its illuminated windows shining like beacons in the night. Caroline looked at the structure with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "Is this where you live?" she asked, her voice barely masking her astonishment. Alexander nodded, a discreet smile on his lips. "Yes, welcome to my humble abode." As he helped her out of the car, he couldn't help but notice how Caroline seemed strangely familiar with her surroundings, despite her obvious discomfort. Her eyes scanned the facade of the mansion with a look that went beyond the mere curiosity of a stranger. "Let's go in," Alexander said softly. "I'm sure you'd like to freshen up and maybe have something to eat." Caroline hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Rothschild. Your kindness. I can't thank you enough." As they walked towards the main entrance, Alexander couldn't help feeling that he was about to embark on an adventure that would change his life forever. The mystery surrounding Caroline Astor was like a complex puzzle, and he was determined to unravel every piece. The door to the mansion opened, revealing a luxurious interior that contrasted drastically with Caroline's current appearance. Alexander noticed how her eyes scanned the room, a mixture of familiarity and nostalgia in her gaze. "Welcome to my home, Caroline," he said, leading her inside. "We'll take care of you, and when you're ready, we can talk. I have a feeling you have a fascinating story to tell." Caroline looked at him, a shadow of a smile on her lips. "You have no idea, Mr. Rothschild. You have no idea." And with those enigmatic words, they entered the mansion, leaving behind the cold New York night and plunging into a world of secrets, intrigues, and possibilities that neither of them could have foreseen. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air of the Rothschild mansion's spacious kitchen. Alexander watched Caroline carefully as she held the steaming cup in both hands, as if seeking comfort in its warmth. After a hot bath and clean clothes provided by the housekeeper, Caroline looked like a completely different person from the woman he had almost run over hours before. "How are you feeling?" Alexander asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Caroline looked up, meeting his gaze. "Better, thank you. Your hospitality is amazing." Alexander leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the marble kitchen table. "Caroline, I know we've only just met, but I can't ignore the fact that there's something very peculiar about your situation. You bear the surname of one of the most influential families in New York. But I found you." "On the streets, as a beggar?" Caroline added, a bitter smile forming on her lips. She sighed deeply before continuing. "Mr. Rothschild." "Alexander, please," he interrupted her gently. "Alexander E., she corrected. "What I'm about to tell you may sound crazy. In fact, there are times when I doubt my own sanity." The businessman nodded, encouraging her to continue. Caroline took a sip of coffee, as if seeking courage in the hot liquid. "My full name is Caroline Elizabeth Astor. I am, or was, the heiress to the Astor fortune. 3 months ago, I had it all: money, status, a bright future ahead of me. Now, as you can see, I have nothing but the clothes on my body." Alexander frowned, puzzled. What happened? Caroline closed her eyes for a moment, as if reliving a painful memory. "It was just after my grandfather, William Astor III, died. He was the patriarch of the family, the guardian of our secrets and fortune. In his will, he left specific instructions to me, his only granddaughter." She paused, her fingers gripping the cup tighter. "He left me a series of clues, a kind of elaborate treasure hunt. He said that only then would I prove myself worthy of the true Astor heritage." Alexander leaned forward even more, completely absorbed in the story. "And what happened when you started following these leads?" Caroline's face darkened. "That's when everything fell apart. Every clue I followed led me to shocking revelations about my family's history. Dark secrets, illicit dealings, betrayals. It was as if all the Astors' greatness was built on a rotten foundation." "But that doesn't explain how you ended up on the streets," Alexander pointed out, his mind working to connect the dots. Caroline nodded, a glint of determination in her eyes. "The more I found out, the more dangerous the situation became. I realized I was being followed, threatened. Someone didn't want me to get to the end of this quest. That's when I decided that the only way to survive and continue investigating was to disappear." Alexander leaned back in his chair, absorbing the magnitude of what he had just heard. "So you faked your own death?" "Not exactly," Caroline replied. "I simply disappeared. I abandoned everything. My identity, my fortune, my life. For the last few months, I've been living in the shadows, following my grandfather's clues and trying to uncover the truth behind the Astor legacy." Silence fell over the kitchen as Alexander processed the extraordinary story he had just heard. Part of him wanted to doubt, to question Caroline's sanity. But there was a sincerity in her eyes, a conviction in her voice that was impossible to ignore. "And where has this search taken you so far?" he finally asked. Caroline placed her cup on the table, her eyes meeting Alexander's with an intensity that took him by surprise. "At your door, apparently. Alexander, I don't believe in coincidences. The fact that you met me tonight, I think it's part of something bigger." Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "My grandfather's last clues," Caroline explained, leaning forward, repeatedly mentioned a forgotten wedding ring. "At first, I thought it was a metaphor, but now—" She paused, her eyes scanning Alexander's face as if seeing him for the first time. "Now I wonder if he wasn't referring to an alliance between our families." The businessman felt his heart race. The idea was absurd, and yet memories of whispered conversations he had overheard in his youth, old documents he had briefly seen in his father's office, all began to take on new meaning. "Caroline," he said slowly, "I think we need to investigate this further. If what you're saying is true, the implications are enormous." She nodded, a mixture of relief and apprehension on her face. "You believe me, then?" Alexander stood up, walking over to the kitchen window. The Manhattan skyline shone in the distance, a reminder of the world they were both part of, a world of power, wealth, and secrets. "I believe there's more to this story than either of us can imagine," he replied, turning to face her. "And I believe that, for some reason, we were put in each other's way. The question now is, what do we do about it?" Caroline stood up, joining him by the window. "We continue the search. Together. I know it's a lot to ask, especially of someone I barely know, but—" Alexander interrupted her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "Caroline, when I met you tonight, I felt like my life was about to change. Now I know I was right. Whatever lies ahead, we'll face it together." As the first rays of the sun began to tint the New York sky, Alexander and Caroline exchanged a look of determination. The mystery that had brought them together was only just beginning to unfold, and they both knew that the secrets they were about to unearth could shake the very foundations of their lives and the society they knew. Outside the mansion, a shadowy figure watched the scene through the window, a telephone pressed against his ear. "Sir," the voice whispered into the handset, "we have a problem. She's found the Rothschilds." Alexander Rothschild's office was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, the walls lined with shelves full of antique books and carefully selected objets d'art. Caroline watched in fascination as he typed in a series of codes on a panel discreetly hidden behind a Monet painting. "My father always said that the most important secrets should be kept in plain sight," Alexander commented, a slight smile playing on his lips as a section of wall slid silently away, revealing a built-in safe. Caroline approached, her curiosity momentarily overcoming her caution. "What exactly are we looking for?" Alexander withdrew a carved wooden box from the safe, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Honestly, I'm not sure, but if there is any evidence of a connection between our families, it will be here." He placed the box on the coffee table and opened it carefully. The interior was filled with yellowed documents, old photographs, and what looked like a leather-bound diary. "These are my great-grandfather's personal archives," Alexander explained, picking up the diary carefully. "Frederick Rothschild. He rarely talked about the past, but my father always suspected that he kept secrets that could shake our family." Caroline picked up one of the photographs, her eyes widening in recognition. "Alexander, look at this." The sepia photograph showed two men in suits, shaking hands in front of an imposing building. One of them was clearly a younger Rothschild, probably Frederick. The other— "It's William Astor too," Caroline whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "My great-grandfather." Alexander examined the photo closely, noting the date written on the back, September 15, 1929. That was just a few weeks before the stock market crash of 1929. What were our great-grandfathers up to? Caroline flipped quickly through Frederick's diary, stopping at an entry dated the same day as the photo. "Here," she pointed, reading aloud. "Agreement sealed with W. A. The plan is in motion. May God forgive us for what we are about to do, but it is for the greater good. Order must prevail." Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. The order. What order? Before Caroline could answer, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the mansion, followed by muffled screams. Alexander reacted instantly, pulling Caroline behind his desk and pressing a button hidden under the top. "What's going on?" Caroline whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. "Invaders," Alexander replied tensely, his eyes fixed on the office door. "It seems we're not the only ones interested in these secrets." The sound of heavy footsteps approached quickly. Alexander picked up the box of documents and handed it to Caroline. "There's a secret passage behind that bookcase," he instructed quickly. "It leads to an underground bunker. Go, and don't come out until I come for you." Caroline grabbed the box, but hesitated. "And you?" Alexander smiled, a determined glint in his eyes. "I'll buy some time and try to find out who our uninvited guests are. Now go." Reluctantly, Caroline moved towards the bookcase, triggering the hidden mechanism that Alexander had shown her moments before. As the passage opened, she cast one last glance at Alexander, who was now standing, facing the door with a posture that emanated a dangerous calm. The office door burst inwards and 3 masked, armed men burst in. Alexander, surprisingly, showed no fear. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cold and controlled, "I'm afraid you didn't schedule this meeting." The apparent leader of the group stepped forward, his gun pointed directly at Alexander's chest. "Where's the Astor girl, Rothschild, and the documents?" Alexander arched an eyebrow, his composure unwavering. "Astor girl, documents. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. Perhaps we should discuss this like civilized men, without these unnecessary weapons." The invader laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Always the diplomat, aren't you, Rothschild? But this time, your soft words won't save you. The order doesn't tolerate traitors." The mention of the order made Alexander's eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. "Ah, so that's what this is about. Tell me, does your employer know that they're trespassing on the property of one of New York's most prominent members of high society? That hardly seems discreet." The leader hesitated for a moment, clearly not expecting this reaction. Alexander took the opportunity to step forward, his voice taking on a tone of authority that made the invaders instinctively back away. "You have exactly 30 seconds to leave my property before I trigger a silent alarm that will bring not only the police, but also a highly trained private security team. And believe me, they'll be asking far more unpleasant questions than I will." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the leader made an abrupt gesture to his companions. "Let's go." "But it's not over, Rothschild. The order will be watching." As soon as the invaders had left, Alexander ran into the secret passage, finding Caroline huddled at the beginning of the tunnel, the document box pressed against her chest. "It's all right," he assured her, helping her to her feet. "They've gone, for now." Caroline looked at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "How did you do that? Who were they?" Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not sure, but one thing is clear. We're messing with something much bigger and more dangerous than we imagined." They emerged back into the office, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. Caroline placed the box on the desk, spreading out its contents. "Alexander," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I think I've found something." She held out a sealed envelope, the wax seal still intact. On it, engraved in gold, was a symbol, a pyramid with an eye in the center. "What's that?" Alexander asked, leaning over to examine the envelope. Caroline swallowed, her face pale. "If the stories my grandfather used to tell are true, this is the symbol of the Order, a secret society which, according to him, has controlled the destinies of New York's most powerful families for generations." Alexander picked up the envelope, feeling its weight in his hand. "Well, it looks like we've just gone down a very deep rabbit hole, Ms. Astor." Caroline nodded, a determined glint appearing in her eyes. "And there's no going back now. What do we do next?" Alexander looked out of the window, watching the Manhattan skyline, the city lights twinkling like earthly stars. "Now," he said, turning to face her, "now we find out the truth, no matter the cost." As the sun began to set over the city that never sleeps, Alexander and Caroline prepared to delve deeper into the secrets of their families and the mysterious order. Little did they know that each step would bring them closer to a truth that could not only change their lives, but rewrite the very history of New York. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows of Alexander's security apartment, located in the heart of the Upper West Side. Caroline was bent over a makeshift desk, surrounded by scattered documents and empty coffee cups. Her eyes, although tired after a sleepless night, shone with determination. Alexander entered the room, carrying a tray with fresh coffee and some toast. "Any progress?" he asked, placing the tray next to Caroline. She sighed, rubbing her eyes. "Maybe. I've been going through your great-grandfather's diary and comparing it with some of the documents we brought. There are repeated mentions of something called Project Phoenix." Alexander leaned over the table, examining Caroline's notes. "Project Phoenix? That sounds ominous." "I agree," Caroline said, picking up a cup of coffee. "And it looks like it was scheduled to be implemented right after the stock market crash of 1929. Look at that." She pointed to a diary entry dated November 1929. "Economic chaos provided the perfect smokescreen. Project Phoenix is underway. The selected families will emerge from the ashes more powerful than ever. While the rest of the world struggles to recover, the order will ensure our ascension." Alexander felt a knot forming in his stomach. "My God, Caroline, this suggests that our families, that the order, somehow benefited from the suffering caused by the Great Depression." Caroline nodded somberly. "It would seem so. And there's more. Look at this list." She pushed a yellowed piece of paper towards Alexander. On it, there was a list of names, including Rothschild, Astor, Vanderbilt, and several other prominent New York families. "These were the selected families?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I believe so," Caroline confirmed. "But there's something strange. See the numbers next to each name." Alexander examined the list more closely. Each family had a number associated with it, ranging from 1 to 13. "What do you think they mean?" Caroline bit her lip, hesitantly. "I'm not sure, but remember that sealed envelope we found? The one with the order symbol on it?" Alexander nodded, picking up the envelope from the table. The wax seal was still intact, the pyramid symbol with the eye in the center glowing subtly in the sunlight. "I think it's time we opened it," Caroline said, her voice a mixture of anxiety and determination. Alexander hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the story in his hands. Then, with one swift movement, he broke the seal. The envelope contained a single folded piece of paper. When Alexander opened it, they both gasped. It was a detailed map of Manhattan, but not as they knew it. Strange lines and symbols crisscrossed the island, connecting various marked points. "What's that?" Alexander murmured, his eyes scanning the map with fascination. Caroline leaned closer, her eyes widening in recognition. "Alexander, look. Those dots. They correspond to the locations of the mansions of the families on the list." She was right. Each dot on the map had a number corresponding to the numbers on the list of families. The Rothschild mansion was marked with the number 7, while the old Astor estate carried the number 3. "But what do those lines mean? And those strange symbols?" Alexander asked, tracing one of the lines with his finger. Caroline frowned, concentrating. "I'm not sure, but wait a minute." She picked up an old book from a nearby pile, flipping through it quickly. "Here, these symbols, they're alchemical." "Alchemical?" Alexander repeated, incredulous. "As in, turning lead into gold?" Caroline nodded, excited despite the seriousness of the situation. Alchemy wasn't just about physical transformation. Many alchemists believed that they could transform reality itself, shape destiny. What if the Phoenix Project was something like that? An attempt to transmute the destiny of New York, and perhaps the whole world. Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. The idea was absurd, and yet, considering everything they had discovered so far, it didn't seem so impossible. "But why Manhattan?" he asked, more to himself than to Caroline. Why these specific families? Caroline picked up the map, examining it more closely. There's something else here. You see, in the center of all these lines, in the heart of Manhattan, where all the lines converged, there was a larger, more elaborate symbol. It was a combination of the pyramid and the eye they had seen before, but surrounded by a circle of alchemical symbols. The nexus, Alexander whispered, a sudden realization hitting him. It's the focal point of the whole, whatever that is. Caroline nodded slowly. And do you know what exactly is located at that point these days? Alexander felt his heart racing, already knowing the answer before Caroline even said it. Federal Hall, she confirmed. The place where George Washington took his oath as the first president of the United States, the cradle of American democracy. Silence fell over the apartment as the implications of this revelation hit them. Alexander was the first to break it. Caroline, he said, his voice laden with urgency. We need to go there. Now. She stared at him, a mixture of fear and determination in her eyes. You're right. Whatever the order planned almost a century ago, Federal Hall is the key to understanding everything. As they prepared to leave, gathering the most crucial documents, Alexander couldn't help feeling that they were about to cross a point of no return. The mystery they had unearthed went far beyond their families or even New York. It was something that could rewrite the very history of the nation. Caroline, he called, stopping her at the door. When she turned around, he saw in her the same mix of emotions he felt: fear, excitement, determination. No matter what happens, we're in this together. She smiled, a gesture that lit up her tired face. Together, she agreed. And with that, they set off into the bustling streets of New York, carrying with them secrets that could shake the very foundations of the city and the country. Federal Hall awaited them, and with it, answers that could change everything. As they mingled with the crowd, neither of them noticed the shadowy figure watching them from across the street, a phone pressed to his ear. They're moving, the figure muttered, and they're going exactly where we wanted them to. Federal Hall stood imposingly before them, its neoclassical facade contrasting with the modern skyscrapers that surrounded it. Alexander and Caroline paused for a moment, observing the constant stream of tourists and New Yorkers hurrying past the historic building, oblivious to the secrets that might be buried beneath their feet. It's surreal, isn't it? Caroline murmured, her eyes roaming over the statue of George Washington at the entrance. To think that for all this time, Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of the documents hidden in his briefcase. Let's go. The sooner we get in, the sooner we can start unraveling this mystery. They mingled with the crowd, passing through security with ease thanks to the VIP passes Alexander had provided. Once inside, the buzz of the city was replaced by the reverent silence of the main hall. Where do we start? Caroline asked, her voice low. Alexander consulted the map they had discovered. The focal point seems to be over there. He pointed to an area near the center of the hall. They approached cautiously, their eyes scanning every detail of the marble floor, the ornate walls, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Alexander, look, Caroline suddenly whispered, pointing to an almost imperceptible pattern on the floor. It was a set of subtle lines that formed a familiar design, the same pyramid with the eye that they had seen on the seal of the order. Alexander knelt down, running his fingers over the pattern. Incredible. How come no one noticed this before? Maybe no one was looking, Caroline replied, joining him on the floor. Or maybe... Her words were interrupted by a soft click. The pattern under her fingers had moved slightly. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to shake. Alexander grabbed Caroline instinctively, pulling her back as a circular section of the floor began to open up, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into darkness. "Oh my God!" Caroline gasped, her eyes wide with astonishment. Alexander looked around, but no one else in the hall seemed to have noticed the opening. It was as if they were in a bubble, cut off from the rest of the world. "I think we've found our entrance," he said, a tense smile on his lips. "Ready to go down the rabbit hole?" Caroline swallowed, but nodded resolutely. "Together, remember." They started down the spiral staircase, the light from the hall above dimming with each step. Alexander activated the flashlight on his cell phone, illuminating the path ahead. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a circular chamber. The walls were covered in symbols and inscriptions, some familiar from the map they had studied, others completely unknown. In the center of the chamber, on a stone pedestal, rested an object that made them both stop, dumbfounded. It was a crystal sphere, the size of a bowling ball, emitting a soft, pulsating light. Inside it, images and patterns moved and changed constantly, as if it were alive. "What is it?" Alexander whispered, his voice echoing in the chamber. Caroline approached slowly, her eyes fixed on the sphere. "I'm not sure, but—" "Alexander, look at the inscriptions around it." He examined the walls, recognizing some of the alchemical symbols they had seen before. Transmutation, destiny, temporal nexus. My God, Caroline, that's a device for manipulating time and space, a deep, familiar voice added behind them. Alexander and Caroline turned sharply. At the entrance to the chamber stood a tall, imposing man, his eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and something else. Sadness. "Father," Alexander gasped, immediately recognizing the figure of Robert Rothschild. Robert entered the chamber, followed by two men Alexander recognized as part of the Rothschild family's security detail. "Hello, son," Robert said, his gaze moving from Alexander to Caroline. "And you must be young Astor. I must say, you two have given us quite a hunt." Caroline stepped forward, putting herself between Alexander and his father. "What's going on here? What's all this?" Robert sighed, approaching the sphere. "This, my dear, is the Order's legacy, the culmination of centuries of planning and sacrifice." "The Order?" Alexander repeated, his mind spinning. You're part of it." Robert nodded solemnly. "Just like your great-grandfather, and Caroline's great-grandfather, and all the generations before us. We were the guardians of this secret, waiting for the right moment." "The right moment for what?" Caroline demanded, her voice trembling slightly. Robert touched the sphere gently, making the images inside it spin faster. "To correct the course of history, to guide humanity towards a better future." Alexander felt a wave of nausea. "You manipulated events. Was the crash of 1929 your doing?" Robert turned to face them, his eyes shining with an almost feverish intensity. "Sometimes, son, you have to cause a bit of chaos to create real order. Project Phoenix wasn't just about enriching a few families. It was about positioning the right pieces on the board for the big game." Caroline stepped forward, her voice filled with indignation. "And who gave you the right to play with people's lives like that? To decide the fate of millions?" Robert looked at her with a mixture of admiration and pity. "My dear, someone had to do it. The world was on the brink of total chaos. It still is. But with this," he gestured to the sphere, "we can finally guide humanity into an era of true peace and prosperity." Alexander felt his heart hammering in his chest. Everything he believed in, everything he thought he knew about his family and its history, was crumbling before his eyes. "And now?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "What happens now?" Robert smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Now, my son, you both have a choice to make. Join us, take your rightful places in the Order, and help shape the future of humanity. Or—" He left the sentence hanging in the air, but the implied threat was clear. Alexander and Caroline exchanged a look. At that moment, without words, they came to an understanding. Whatever choice they made, it would be together. "Well," Alexander said, turning to face his father, "I suppose we have a lot to discuss." As the tension in the chamber reached its peak, the orb on the pedestal pulsed more intensely, as if feeling the weight of the moment. The choices that Alexander and Caroline would make in the next few moments would not only determine their own destinies, but potentially the course of human history. And so, in the secret heart of New York, under the feet of millions of people going about their lives oblivious to the drama unfolding, the fate of the world hung by a thread. The silence in the underground chamber was almost palpable, broken only by the soft hum of the crystalline sphere on the central pedestal. Alexander stared at his father, Robert Rothschild, a storm of conflicting emotions in his eyes. Beside him, Caroline remained tense, her mind working furiously to process everything they had discovered. "Before we make any decisions," Alexander finally spoke, his voice echoing in the chamber, "I want to know everything. No more secrets, no more half-truths. If you expect us to join you, Dad, then we deserve to know exactly what we're getting into." Robert nodded slowly, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Fair enough. Where should I start?" "At the beginning," Caroline interjected, her voice firm. "How did it all begin, and why?" Robert walked over to the sphere, his fingers hovering over its shiny surface. "The Order," he began, "has existed for much longer than you can imagine. Its true origins are lost in the mists of history, but we know that it took its present form at the end of the 18th century, shortly after the founding of the United States." He paused, his eyes lost in memories of a past that was not his own. The nation's founders, men like Washington, Franklin, and others whose names history has forgotten, saw the potential of this new country. But they also saw its dangers. They feared that, without guidance, the American experiment could fail, leading the world into a future of chaos and tyranny. So they created the Order, Alexander concluded, the pieces falling into place in his mind. Robert nodded. "Precisely. A secret group of individuals dedicated to guiding the course of history, not just of America, but of the entire world. And at the center of it all," he gestured to the sphere, "was this." Caroline approached the sphere, her eyes reflecting the ever-changing images inside. "What exactly is this?" "We call it the Nexus," Robert explained. Well, to put it simply, it's a window into the fabric of time and space itself. With it, we can see possible futures, and to a certain extent, influence them. Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. "So that's how you do it. How you manipulate events." Robert shook his head. "It's not that simple, son. The Nexus shows us possibilities, not certainties, and our ability to influence events is limited. We can give a little push here and there, but the big changes? Those require careful planning and patience." "Like the crash of 1929, Caroline murmured, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Exactly," Robert confirmed. "It was a bold move, perhaps the most dramatic we've ever made, but it was necessary. The world was moving in a dangerous direction, and we needed to readjust course." Alexander frowned, a nagging question forming in his mind. "And who decides what is necessary? Who gives you the right to make these choices for the rest of humanity?" Robert sighed heavily, for the first time seeming to feel the weight of his responsibilities. "It's a fair question, Alexander, and one that every member of the Order must face. We are not gods, far from it. We're human, with all the flaws and weaknesses that implies. But someone has to make those difficult choices." He turned to Caroline, his eyes softening. "Your grandfather, William Astor, he understood this better than most. It was he who perfected our ability to use the Nexus, who helped us refine our interventions." Caroline felt a wave of conflicting emotions on hearing about her grandfather. Pride mixed with horror, admiration with disappointment. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you plan to do now?" Robert straightened up, his face taking on an expression of determination. "The world is once again on the brink of chaos. Climate change, political instability, economic inequality. We're approaching a tipping point, and Nexus..."
"Well, it has shown us possible futures that are, frankly, terrifying." Alexander and Caroline exchanged a worried glance. "What kind of futures?" "Not sure if I wanted to know the answer." Robert hesitated for a moment before answering. "Global environmental collapse, the end of civilization as we know it, but we've also seen bright futures of unparalleled peace and prosperity. The problem is..."
"The road to those better futures is narrow and fraught with danger." He approached Alexander and Caroline, his voice low and intense. "That's why we need you. The next generation of the order? Fresh, with new perspectives, but with the knowledge and heritage to understand what's at stake. Alexander felt the weight of his father's expectation, of generations of Rothschilds before him. Beside him, Caroline seemed equally burdened by the Astor legacy. "What if we refuse?" Caroline asked, her voice trembling slightly. Robert's face hardened. "Then we'll have to take measures to protect the secret of the order and ensure that our work continues." The implied threat hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Alexander stepped forward, placing himself between his father and Caroline. "You've given us a lot to think about, Dad, but you can't expect us to make a decision like this so suddenly. We need time." Robert studied his son for a long moment before nodding slowly. "You're right. Of course. It's a monumental decision. I'll give you 24 hours. But no more than that. Time, as you can imagine, is of the essence." He gestured to his guards, who approached Alexander and Caroline. "You will be escorted back to the surface and kept under surveillance. Don't try to escape or contact anyone. The consequences would be unpleasant." As they were led out of the secret chamber, back to the normal world above, Alexander and Caroline exchanged a meaningful look. In 24 hours, they would have to make a choice that would change not only their lives, but potentially the course of human history. The pressure was overwhelming, the weight of responsibility almost unbearable. And yet, amidst the whirlwind of emotions and revelations, one thing remained clear to both of them. Whatever decision they made, they would make it together. As they emerged into the daylight, the buzz of New York City enveloping them once again, Alexander and Caroline found themselves looking at the world around them with new eyes. Every person passing by, every building, every seemingly insignificant decision. It could all be part of a bigger plan, a cosmic chessboard on which they were now invited to play. The clock was ticking. In 24 hours, destiny awaited. The sun was setting over Manhattan, tinting the sky with shades of orange and pink, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding in the lives of Alexander Rothschild and Caroline Astor. The two of them were sitting in silence on the rooftop of the hotel where they had been hosted by the order's guards, watching the city that never sleeps come alive with millions of lights. "It's strange, isn't it?" Caroline finally broke the silence, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Looking at all this and knowing that there's so much more going on behind the scenes." Alexander nodded, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "All my life, I thought I understood how the world worked. Money, power, influence. But that's something completely different." Caroline turned to face him, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "What are we going to do, Alexander? We only have a few hours to decide, and I honestly don't know what to think." Alexander stood up, walking to the edge of the terrace. The city stretched out below them, vast and imposing. "On the one hand," he began, his voice low and thoughtful, "the idea of having that kind of influence, of really being able to make a difference on a global scale, it's tempting. But on the other," Caroline added, joining him, "who are we to make these decisions, to play God with the lives of billions of people?" Alexander turned to her, taking her hands in his. "Caroline, ever since we met, it's been one crazy thing after another. But one thing has become clear to me. I trust you. More than that, I've fallen in love with you." Caroline gasped softly, her eyes widening in surprise. "Alexander, Wait," he interrupted her gently. "Let me finish. What I'm trying to say is, whatever decision we make, I want us to make it together. If we decide to join the order, we'll do it as a team. And if we decide to refuse, well, we'll face the consequences side by side." Caroline felt tears forming in her eyes. "I love you too, Alexander. And you're right. We're in this together, no matter what." They embraced, finding comfort in each other amidst the chaos of their lives turned upside down. When they finally separated, there was a new determination in their gazes. "So," Caroline said, a small smile playing on her lips, "how are we going to decide the fate of the world?" Alexander laughed, the sound relieving some of the tension. Well, I think we should start by listing the pros and cons. Over the next few hours, they debated, argued, and pondered. They discussed ethics, responsibility, the weight of knowledge, and the price of power. They considered the ramifications of their choices, not just for themselves, but for the whole world. As the evening progressed, one conclusion began to crystallize. "We can't do this," Alexander finally said, his voice firm. "We can't join the order." Caroline nodded, a mixture of relief and apprehension on her face. "I agree. The power they have is too much for any group of people, no matter how noble their intentions." "But," Alexander continued, an idea forming in his mind, "we can't just turn our backs and pretend we don't know what we know either." Caroline raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "What are you thinking?" Alexander began to pace back and forth, his mind working furiously. What if, instead of joining them or simply refusing, what if we offered a third option? "What kind of third option?" Caroline asked, leaning forward with interest. "One where we use our knowledge and resources to make a difference, but in an open and transparent way," Alexander explained, his voice gaining enthusiasm. "No secret manipulations, no playing with the fate of humanity in the shadows. Instead, we have created an organization that works in the open, that uses the influence of the Rothschild and Astor families for good, but in a way that can be seen and judged by the public." Caroline pondered for a moment. Then a slow smile began to form on her face. "A foundation," she said. "A global foundation dedicated to tackling humanity's greatest challenges. Climate change, inequality, conflicts." "Exactly," Alexander exclaimed. "We use the knowledge we gain about possible futures to guide our actions, but we leave the final decisions in people's hands. We educate, empower, provide resources." "It's brilliant," Caroline said, getting up to hug him. "It's risky, of course. The order might not like it." "They'll have to accept it," Alexander said firmly. "Or they'll have to silence us publicly, which would go against everything they stand for." As the first ray of morning sun began to sneak over the horizon, Alexander and Caroline prepared to face Robert Rothschild and the order. They had a plan, they had each other, and they had the conviction that they were doing the right thing. "Ready?" Alexander asked, holding out his hand to Caroline. She entwined her fingers in his, smiling. "Ready." Together, they left the penthouse, ready to face not only the order, but the future they had chosen to create. A future of hope, transparency, and infinite possibilities. As the elevator took them back to the world outside, they both knew that the real adventure had only just begun. The fate of the world was at stake. But for the first time since all this madness began, they felt truly prepared to face it. The day was dawning in New York, and with it, the dawn of a new era. An era that Alexander Rothschild and Caroline Astor would help shape, not in the shadows, but in the light of day for all to see. Federal Hall was quiet that Sunday morning, a marked contrast to the tumult that usually filled its historic halls during the week. Alexander Rothschild and Caroline Astor walked hand in hand through the silent corridors, their footsteps echoing off the marble walls. The tension was palpable between them, but there was also an unwavering determination in their gazes. When they reached the secret entrance leading to the underground chamber, they found Robert Rothschild waiting for them, his imposing figure illuminated by the soft light emanating from the hidden passage. "I see you've made your decision," Robert said, his voice a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Alexander nodded, squeezing Caroline's hand lightly. "Yes, Father. We have a proposal for you and the order." Robert raised an eyebrow, gesturing for them to follow him. "Then we'd better discuss it downstairs." The descent into the secret chamber seemed shorter this time, perhaps because they now knew what awaited them. When they entered the circular space, they noticed that they were not alone. Several hooded figures awaited them, forming a semicircle around the central pedestal where the nexus sphere pulsed gently. "The Council of the Order," Robert explained, taking his place among the figures. "They are here to hear your decision and, if necessary, determine the consequences." Caroline stepped forward, her voice firm and clear. "First of all, We want you to know that we understand the importance of what you do here. The responsibility you bear is immense, and we recognize the sacrifice you have made over the centuries." Alexander continued. "However, after much reflection, we have come to the conclusion that we cannot join the order, at least, not in the way it currently exists." A murmur ran through the group of hooded figures. Robert frowned, but gestured for them to continue. "Instead," Alexander continued, "we propose a fundamental change in the way the order operates. An evolution, if you will." Caroline took the cue. "We propose the creation of a global, open and transparent foundation. An organization that will use the order's knowledge and resources, but in a way that can be seen and judged by the public." "Impossible," one of the hooded figures exclaimed. "Exposing our secrets would destroy everything we work for." "We're not suggesting exposing all the order's secrets," Alexander quickly clarified. "The Nexus and its true nature would remain hidden, but we would use the knowledge it provides to guide public and transparent actions." "Think about it," Caroline added, her voice passionate. "Instead of manipulating events in the shadows, we could lead openly, educate people about the challenges we face, empower them to make informed decisions." Robert stepped forward, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "What if the public makes the wrong decisions? If they lead us into one of the catastrophic futures we've seen?" Alexander met his father's gaze. "Then we'll have to rely on humanity to learn from its mistakes and adapt. We can't keep deciding the fate of billions without their knowledge or consent." A heavy silence fell over the chamber. The Nexus pulsed more intensely, as if responding to the tension in the air. Finally, one of the hooded figures spoke, his voice laden with wisdom. Maybe it's time for a change. We've been operating in the shadows for so long that we've forgotten what sunlight is like." Another figure nodded. "The new generation always brings new ideas. Maybe we should listen to them." Robert looked around, observing the reactions of his colleagues. Then, slowly, a smile began to form on his lips. "My son," he said, turning to Alexander, "you surprise me. I thought I was offering you and Caroline supreme power, but you have found an even greater form of power, the power of truth and trust." He moved closer, putting one hand on Alexander's shoulder and the other on Caroline's. "It won't be easy. The transition will be challenging, and there will be resistance. But I believe you are right. It's time to bring the order into the light." In the months and years that followed, the world witnessed the birth of the Phoenix Foundation, a global organization dedicated to tackling humanity's greatest challenges. Led by Alexander Rothschild and Caroline Astor, the foundation quickly became a powerful force for positive change. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the order was evolving. The Nexus continued to be consulted, but now its visions were used to inform public policy and global initiatives rather than secret manipulations. 5 years after that fateful morning in Federal Hall, Alexander and Caroline were back in the secret chamber, but this time they weren't alone. With them was their newborn daughter, Sophia. As they held the little one in their arms, the Nexus pulsed with a brighter light than ever before. "What do you think it means?" Caroline asked, amazed. Alexander smiled, kissing his daughter's forehead. "I think it means that the future is brighter than ever, and that Sophia here will have an important role to play in it." As they left the chamber, climbing back up to the world above, Alexander and Caroline knew that their journey was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more difficult decisions to make, but now they would face these challenges in the light of day, with the world at their side. The sun was shining over New York as they emerged from Federal Hall. It was a new day, the dawn of a new era. And together, hand in hand, with their daughter in their arms, Alexander and Caroline were ready to shape that future, not as secret manipulators, but as transparent and inspiring leaders. The fate of the world was still at stake, but now, for the first time in history, everyone had a chance to take part in the game, and that, more than any secret power or mystical artifact, was the true magic that Alexander and Caroline had discovered on their extraordinary journey.